The board fired me on Friday. On Monday, I walked back in and revealed I owned the whole company, and they had no idea. This is the story of the most satisfying corporate revenge you'll ever hear. They slipped right into the seat that should have been mine, so I went ahead and took their entire company instead. My name's Evan, I'm 38, and up until last Friday, I was, at least on paper, an employee at Myers Technologies, the manufacturing business my late father-in-law, Franklin, built 5 decades ago. I say on paper because nobody there ever acted like my job meant anything. To the board, I was nothing more than a spoiled trust fund husband who married the boss daughter. They'd whisper that I was just the useless son-in-law with a fake job, usually said by the same people who needed their accountants to do the math on their own personal budgets. They had no clue what was headed their way. Let me rewind a bit. I met Lena, Franklin's daughter, 9 years back. Her dad was a sharp businessman who actually knew how to read a balance sheet, unlike most of the people supposedly helping him run the place. Franklin wasn't just my father-in-law. He turned into my mentor and my go-to chess opponent. We spent countless nights in his study, laughing over top-shelf scotch about how clueless the board was, quietly mapping out what we'd do when the company eventually needed saving from the very folks in charge. While everyone else dismissed me as dead six, Franklin saw something in me. He taught me the real side of the business, not the polished classroom version. The late-night talks with factory leads, the down-and-dirty details of how the operation actually ran, the importance of knowing every employee's name, not just the ones who might help your career. He figured out early that I cared about the company itself, not just stock prices. 4 years ago, Lena and I got married, and I slipped into one of those vague analyst roles at the company that nobody bothered to take seriously. The board treated me like I was part of the core. ID heard them say that exact thing more than once. In their eyes, I was just the guy who married into money and somehow hadn't magically turned into a cold-hearted CEO. Perfect. I was happy to let them underestimate me. 6 months ago, Franklin got hit with a terminal cancer diagnosis. For weeks before he passed, he brought me into his study, poured each of us 4 fingers of his favorite whiskey, and pushed a folder across the desk like it was nothing. He told me the doctors had given him a month or 3 at best, and he wasn't about to let those parasites rip apart what had built. Inside that folder were documents transferring 76% controlling interest in Myers Technologies to me. Franklin had engineered the perfect checkmate, even though he knew he wouldn't be around to watch it land. He made me swear to keep it to myself, especially from Lena. He adored his daughter, but he knew she didn't grasp what it actually took to run a company. She understood branding and image and whatever looked good online. In her mind, business was basically another photo op. I'd even seen her Pinterest board full of CEO aesthetic outfits before Franklin was in the ground. We got everything notarized and witnessed by our lawyers and by a notary named Harlan, who ran a tiny office in the suburbs and had no clue she was helping arm a corporate nuclear device. Franklin even finished an expert-level Sudoku puzzle in under 6 minutes that day, just to prove he was mentally sharp. The man prepared for everything. Franklin's funeral 4 weeks ago felt more like a corporate stage show than a memorial. The whole thing played out like some kind of Greek tragedy, complete with dramatic organ music and forced sniffles. Lena stood up front in a designer black dress that looked better suited for an awards show than a funeral, and the board stared at her like a pack of hyenas spotting a fresh carcass. I could practically see the dollar signs spinning in their eyes. Connor Whitfield, the gray-haired chairman who looked like he'd been born in a suit, kept tugging at his tie and giving those meaningful looks to the other vultures. Mark Ellison, whose personality landed somewhere between soggy cardboard and a weak handshake, looked like he could taste the power already. He was probably imagining how he'd redecorate Franklin's corner office. Behind me, someone whispered that I didn't even have a real job and just showed up to mess around on my computer. Thing is, they weren't totally wrong. I didn't have a flashy title or a prime office or business cards I handed out like candy. But what I did have was Franklin's trust, a legitimate business degree from Northwestern that I actually worked for, and a sixth sense for spotting corporate nonsense. After the funeral, Lena threw herself what she called an appointment celebration, though it felt a whole lot more like her personal coronation. The penthouse ballroom looked like a mashup of new money and desperate atwelvation seeking. They even had ice sculptures shaped like the company logo, slowly melting under the hot lights, and dripping symbolic puddles onto the marble floors. There was a champagne fountain straight out of a 1998 wedding, and a string quartet no one paid attention to because everyone was too busy schmoozing. Suddenly, board members who couldn't name a single factory worker were clustered around Lena, toasting new eras and bold leadership and every other empty phrase they loved to throw around. Connor held court by the bar, bragging about how had always known Lena had leadership potential. This was the same guy who told Franklin 6 months earlier that women were too emotional to run companies. But apparently the promise of dollar signs works miracles. Mark cornered me near one of the half-melted ice sculptures, martini in hand, wearing the kind of grin that made me instinctively check for my wallet. He leaned in way too close, his gin breath fighting with his cologne like 3 fumes in a factory fire, and told me what a wild night it was. Then he gave me this pitying pat on the back, the kind you give a dog that failed obedience school. He cracked a joke about how rough it must be going from the CEO's son-in-law to whatever it was I supposedly did around there, laughing at his own cheap shot like it was comedy gold. I could see other board members pre-12ing not to least 12 in. I grinned and told him I'd been breathing and collecting dividends, which, honestly, was far more tiring than it sounded. Sometimes I'd even have to take a seat just to recover. He laughed even harder, totally unaware that Head just congratulated the person who actually signed his checks. Behind him, Connor watched us with the kind of sharp focus a hawk uses when deciding which mouse to grab, probably trying to figure out if I'd stir up trouble or just blend into the background like a well-behaved trust fund ghost. The funny thing about being underestimated is that it works like a secret superpower nobody realizes you have. While Mark was busy imagining some tragic story about poor Evan and his tiny analyst job, I was quietly doing the math on how long it would take me to pull apart his entire career. For weeks, maybe 5 tops, if I felt like doing a thorough job. Friday morning hit me like a 4-6 train nobody had scheduled. At exactly 9 hours 65 minutes a.m., an email from Connor's assistant popped into my inbox, summoning me to conference room A. The tone was about as welcoming as a restraining order. Conference room A was the big one, the intimidation chamber, with floor-to-ceiling glass staring out over downtown Chicago, and a table long enough that you could probably land a small aircraft on it. That room was reserved for the decisions that determined whether whole departments disappeared. When I stepped inside, 6 board members were already parked around that monster of a table. Connor sat at the head. Naturally, I swear he'd sleep in that chair if his wife allowed it. Mark perched to his right wearing a smile that looked like he'd practiced it in the mirror before coming in. Alan Rourke was halfway asleep, which honestly made him the smartest guy present. The other 4 were middle management types whose names slipped my mind. Promotions had carried them farther than Competwelvis ever had. Connor cleared his throat with theatrical flair, like he'd rehearsed this very moment while trying on different ties to see which one made him look the most powerful. He said my name the way someone addresses a houseplant that refuses to grow, then launched into a polished speech about reviewing organizational structure and realigning resources with strategic objectives. Pure corporate word salad. Beautiful, empty jargon strung together like holiday lights. Mark couldn't hold himself back and leaned in like an excited kid about to break bad news. He announced that my position was being terminated effective immediately. The room fell silent except for one guy smacking away at his iPad like he was trying to set a speed record. Laura Kim, the CFO who actually knew what she was doing, stared at her hands as if they held the answers to life. I let the silence sit there. They expected begging, panic, maybe a breakdown. The whole firing ritual depends on the poor soul following the script. Instead, I smiled and said this was great. I'd been worried they'd drag it out and make things uncomfortable. I thanked them for sparing me the agony of an emotional HR exit interview. Their smiles flickered like cheap bulbs about to burn out. Totally off script. Connor's forehead folded in ways that told me his Botox was earning overtime pay. I got to my feet, straight 12'd my tie, and gathered my stuff like I was leaving a CAF instead of a job. I grabbed the fancy pen they'd given me 4 years earlier, now just an overpriced writing stick. I told them it was all business and nothing personal. Companies change, people move on. The circle of corporate life, and all that. Walking toward the door, I could practically feel their confusion radiating behind me like heat coming off asphalt in July. At the doorway, I turned around and gave them my most sincere smile. I told them it had been educational. That ID learned a tremendous amount about corporate governance, strategic planning, and the truly creative limits of expense account fraud. Laura actually choked on air. That weekend was fantastic. I opened the safe hidden behind the abstract painting in my home office, the one Lena thought was just painfully boring art. Shed bought it at a charity auction because the artist was emerging and provocative, which in reality meant had mastered the art of charging $4,000 for something that looked like a toddler's finger painting. Behind the frame sat the biometric safe Franklin had helped me install while Lena was off in Milan doing whatever wealthy women do there. Inside was the document that was about to flip Myers Technologies upside down. The notarized transfer of 76% controlling shares, signed by Franklin 4 weeks before he died. Witnessed by his attorney, my lawyer Megan Kim, and Harlan the notary, who had absolutely no clue what she was stamping. The page was heavy, expensive paper that practically shouted important legal document just by existing. I sent Megan a photo with a simple question. How's our position now that Eve been fired? Her reply came in under half a minute. She had already had 4 firms review it. The transfer was airtight and legally binding. She told me to sit tight and let the board dig their own graves, then congratulated me on the impeccable timing of my termination. So I did exactly what she said. I waited and watched from the sidelines while the board popped champagne, rearranged management like a brutal game of musical chairs, and spread rumors that I was mentally unstable. The gossip started by Monday afternoon. I heard it from Tom, the lobby security guard who liked me because I actually learned his name and asked about his kids. He said folks upstairs were saying ID had some kind of breakdown, which he called nonsense since I was the most normal person in the place. By Wednesday, the rumors had evolved into full-blown fiction. According to buddies in accounting who kept me updated, ID screamed at Lena, hurled a laptop at Mark, been caught day drinking in my office, and was maybe jumping ship to a competitor. My personal favorite was the alleged affair with someone in HR, completely made up and strangely specific. Lena called exactly once through all of this, Thursday evening. She told me people were talking about me and that I was making her look bad. I almost laughed, like I'd gone and fired myself just to spite her. I told her I'd been let go from a job that barely existed in the first place, and if that embarrassed her, maybe the issue wasn't on my end. She hung up without even a goodbye. Meanwhile, Megan kept sending me updates all weekend, some useful, some flat-out hilarious. Saturday afternoon, she forwarded me leaked board meeting minutes. They were already planning to unload 3 subsidiaries under the fancy label of strategic divestment to maximize shareholder value. Both divisions actually made money and had real potential. They were selling off the good assets just to puff up the next quarter before bailing out. Predictable didn't even begin to cover it. The board was doing what short-sighted executives always do, gutting long-term stability for short-term numbers that made their stock options shine. Franklin had seen it coming a mile away, which is why he had made his move when he did. Sunday afternoon, I was knee-deep in financial reports Megan sent over. For reports in, I was scribbling notes in the margins like a teacher grading essays writ 12 by kids who forgot to study. They were planning to sell Kensington Manufacturing to a private equity group for way less than its actual value. Probably because someone on the board had a buddy who expected a kickback. And the startup, Neural Sync, a company working on genuinely impressive AI automation for manufacturing, was being shopped around like a clearance item. It was like watching someone haul a vintage car to the junkyard because they couldn't be bothered to learn what it was worth. Sunday night, my phone lit up. Mark Ellison. I stared at the screen for a good 12 seconds, trying to decide whether answering him was worth the entertainment. Curiosity won. He sounded overly cheerful, the kind of tone people use when they're either drunk, about to ask for something, or both. He asked how my weekend was going and how I was processing everything after being fired. I told him I was reflecting on my feelings, rethinking my life choices, and also making waffles. They turned out great. He paused, trying to decide if I was joking. I was always joking. He said he was calling as a friend, totally off the record, because he knew a guy at some small downtown firm that was always looking for talent. He said he could put in a good word and help me land on my feet. The condescension was so thick I could have sliced it. Mark was offering me an entry-level analyst spot, like he was tossing a life preserver to someone drowning. I asked if the firm needed someone to buy them out by Monday, because I suddenly had capital available and loved new investment opportunities. Silence. Perfect, beautiful silence. I could practically hear his brain struggling to catch up. Eventually, he said he meant something more like an analyst role. Entry level. To get me back in the game. I told him I understood completely. I just figured if we were talking about downtown firms, we might as well think big. But if they needed an analyst, sure, he could send the info. Mark didn't get the joke. He never got jokes unless they were printed on a PowerPoint slide with footnotes. Monday morning, I put on my sharpest Navy suit, the one Lena once claimed made me look like a high-paid accountant. I'd taken it as an insult back then, but now it felt perfect. Accountants fly under the radar and keep records of where all the bodies are buried. I paired it with a crisp white shirt, a burgundy tie Franklin gave me 3 Christmases ago, and cufflinks that had belonged to his father. The Myers building looked the same as always Monday morning, glass and steel climbing into the Chicago skyline. Company logo plastered on the side like it was visible from orbit. Security stopped me before I even made it to the elevators. Tom wasn't there. Instead, it was Dylan, who looked like he'd played college football and treated security work like a full-contact sport. Aaron from HR had to escort me upstairs. The same Aaron who'd processed my termination Friday with the enthusiasm of someone filing a TPS report. We rode up in silence, her clutching her tablet like a riot shield while I quietly hummed the theme from the good, the bad, and the ugly. If you're walking into a showdown, you might as well have the right soundtrack. Eventually, she said the situation was highly irregular. I told her I appreciated that. It meant she took her job seriously. She asked if I was planning something crazy. I asked her to define crazy, because from my point of view, crazy was a board selling off profitable subsidiaries to pad their personal portfolios. I was just there for a chat. I stepped into the boardroom, and every face froze in that special way people freeze when someone they absolutely did not expect walks in. Mark practically inhaled his coffee and started coughing like an old lawnmower trying to start. Connor's expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and the early stages of realizing his Monday was about to fall apart. I greeted everyone cheerfully, set my briefcase down with a heavy thud, apologized to Laura for being gender exclusive, and commented on the beautiful morning. I actually had seen a cardinal on the way in. People say that's good luck. Connor squinted at me like I was a mirage that might vanish if he blinked hard enough. He said slowly that I didn't work there anymore. I agreed entirely. Correct, I'd been fired Friday. I remembered it well. Quite the performance, really, though Alan dozing off halfway through kind of ruined the dramatic 12 vision. Alan startled awake at hearing his name and asked what had missed. I kept going, ignoring the interruption. I told them while I didn't work there anymore I owned there, which made meetings a bit tricky. Then I set the folder down in the middle of the table where everyone could see it. The papers hitting that glossy conference table made a sharper sound than they had any right to. The folder sat there with its label, Transfer of Controlling Interest, Myers Technologies, Inc., plain as daylight. Mark lunged for it first, and I noticed his hand wasn't exactly steady. His face cycled through confidence, then concern, then straight into pure horror before landing on full emotional collapse. He whispered that it couldn't be real, but his voice cracked in a way that told everyone he knew damn well it was. He started rambling, asking if I seriously expected them to believe Franklin had handed the company over to me. Me, the guy who supposedly couldn't even keep an analyst job. His pitch went up with every insult until he sounded like he was trying out for some high school drama production. I held up a finger. First, they fired me, so the whole couldn't hold down a job bit was convenient revisionist history. Second, they were free to believe whatever helped them sleep. I didn't need belief. I had documentation. Piles of it. Notarized, witnessed, reviewed by multiple attorneys, and filed with the section. Feelings didn't get a vote. Connor finally croaked something out. He said this could destabilize the entire company, the shareholders, the investors, the markets. I cut him off. That ship had sailed. They'd already done plenty of destabilizing on their own. I told him I was there to fix what they broke, and to think of me as a very polite hurricane. Laura actually snorted at that before coughing to cover it when Connor shot her a look that could peel paint. Then my phone vibrated loudly across the table. One glance at the screen made me grin. Kensington Holdings, our biggest outside investor. Perfect. I answered and put the call on speaker. Elena Ruiz said she needed a meeting today regarding the ownership shakeup. I watched Connor drain from furious red to a shade of gray I'd only ever seen on gravestones. Anderson held 22%. Not enough to control the place, but definitely enough to ruin someone's week. I told Elena I was in the middle of a board meeting discussing the transition and asked if 3 p.m. worked. It did. She told me to bring my attorney and my CFO. She had a long list of concerns about the board's recent choices. I said I'd bring Megan Kim as legal counsel and asked Laura, right there in front of everyone, if she'd be willing to step in as CFO formally. She looked like she'd just won a sweepstakes and been drafted into the NFL on the same day. Before the call ended, Elena added that she was relieved to finally work with leadership that understood fiduciary responsibility. When the line went dead, that last Centuelvis just sat there like a grenade rolling around with the pin missing. Mark looked absolutely shattered, like someone had broken the news that Santa wasn't real, and then also explained what actually happened to the family dog. He whispered that this was insane, but there was no fight left in him. It was just a man learning he'd lost a game he didn't even realize had started. Out of nowhere, Alan stood up and announced he was retiring. His wife wanted to travel, maybe learn to paint, see Italy. This felt like the right moment. Connor tried to object, but Alan cut him off with more energy than I'd seen from him in years. He said he was 93, rich, and not interested in babysitting a sinking board. Then he looked at me and told me Elena didn't tolerate idiots, so I'd better clean house before the meeting. He walked out without waiting for any reply. I told the rest of them to take a breath. We'd reconvene. I had a 3 p.m. appointment and 5 hours to explain to Elena why they were trying to unload Kensington Manufacturing, named after her own grandfather, for 25% below actual value. I asked Laura to gather every scrap of data on that proposed sale. She already had her laptop open before I finished the Centuelvis. She said she'd argued against the sale, and it was in the minutes. I told her I knew. That was why she was still employed. Mark finally spoke again, barely audible. Was I really going to go through with this? Just take over? I paused in the doorway. I already did. At 3 p.m. sharp, I walked into Kensington Holdings' offices on the 49th floor with Megan and Laura flanking me. Elena's office was exactly what you'd picture for someone who made her first billion before most people figured out how taxes worked. Floor-to-ceiling windows, furniture that cost more than cars, and just one personal item. A black and white photo of an older man I assumed was her grandfather. She stood by the window, offered a handshake that was firm but deliberately controlled, the kind of grip people use when they've mastered the art of quiet intimidation. We took seats around a glass table, and she jumped straight into it. Kensington Holdings didn't invest in chaos. They held 22% of Myers Technologies, and they'd trusted Franklin, tolerated Lena, and now needed to understand exactly what my majority stake meant for their money. I told her plainly, I didn't stir up chaos unless it was necessary, and right now, it was desperately necessary. The board had been treating Myers like their personal ATM and were minutes away from selling her grandfather's company to a private equity scavenger for a bargain bin price. Then I opened Laura's folder. Executive pay freeze until we stabilized. A full audit to find where we were bleeding talent and cash. Leadership cleanup, no more dead six. And investor transparency with monthly reports that were actually honest. Elena read through it with the speed and focus of someone who actually understood what she was looking at. Minutes passed in silence. My phone buzzed. Megan's personal cell she only used for emergencies or good gossip. The message said they were trying to claim Franklin was mentally unfit when he signed. Connor hired a hotshot firm to challenge the share transfer filing in court tomorrow morning. I almost laughed. Of course they were. Hey, I texted back telling Megan to send them Franklin's medical clearance from 3 weeks before he signed and include a Sudoku puzzle. Tell them Franklin completed it the same day in under 8 minutes. Expert level for irony. Megan responded that I was her favorite client and she'd bill them for the puzzle. Elena looked up, catching my smile. Good news. The opposite, actually. The board was trying to challenge the transfer by claiming Franklin wasn't mentally competent at filing tomorrow. Instead of concern, Elena smiled, something almost predatory. If my shares stood, they'd back me fully. 22% voting with my 76%. If they managed to overturn it, They were pulling their entire investment within 120 days and shorting our stock on the way out. She wanted compet leadership and didn't care who provided it, but wouldn't watch her grandfather's legacy get pillaged by idiots. We talked strategy for another hour. Specific cuts, potential hires, timeline for the audit, communication plans. Elena was sharp, asking questions that cut straight to the heart of issues and pointing out problems I hadn't considered. By the time we wrapped, I had a headache. 21 pages of notes and grudging respect for someone who could make me feel simultaneously incompetent and motivated. Tuesday morning arrived crisp and clear. Ironic considering I was spending it in courthouse watching desperate men try to rewrite history. Circuit Court of Cook County wasn't anyone's idea of fun. All institutional beige walls, uncomfortable benches, and the faint smell of stress and defeated dreams. Connor was there with Franklin Patterson, who looked exactly like an expensive lawyer should, silver temples, four-piece suit, probably costing more than most monthly rents, and an air of superiority, suggesting he thought Judge Judy was lowbrow entertainment. Mark was there looking like he hadn't slept. Laura had positioned herself on our side of the aisle, already having made her choice. Judge Laura Morrison entered, maybe 60, gray hair and a no-nonsense bun. Reading glasses, she looked over rather than through, giving her perpetual expression of being deeply unimpressed with everyone's nonsense. I liked her immediately. Franklin Patterson stood with theatrical flourish that suggested he'd practiced this movement in front of mirrors. He claimed a grave injustice had occurred. Franklin had been manipulated in his final days by me into signing away controlling interest while undergoing invasive chemotherapy on significant pain medication not in condition to make sound business decisions. Megan didn't wait to be called before standing. Judge Morrison told her to please save some time. Megan said everything Patterson just said was demonstrably false and frankly insulting to Franklin's memory. She had medical clearance from his oncologist dated the same day as signing, confirming he was of sound mind and not under influence of any impairing medications. She had testimony from notary Harlan Beckett, who spoke with Franklin at length and found him completely lucid. She had testimony from his personal attorney confirming Franklin understood exactly what he was doing. Then she paused for dramatic effect, pulling out paper with flourish matching Patterson's theatrics. They had a completed expert-level Sudoku puzzle. Franklin finished the same day in under 8 minutes with perfect accuracy. I had to bite my cheek to keep from laughing at the expressions. Patterson looked like his law degree was being recalled. Connor went through 9 shades of red. Mark just stared at the puzzle like it was ancient Sumerian. Judge Morrison repeated slowly, "A Sudoku puzzle?" Megan confirmed she was submitting it as a supplementary evidence along with medical documentation, legal testimony, and notarized statements. But yes, a man completing expert Sudoku in under 6 minutes was clearly capable of understanding a share transfer. If Thornon wanted to attempt the same puzzle under similar conditions to prove it wasn't indicative of mental acuity, she was happy to provide one. Several people in the gallery actually laughed, including the court reporter who tried covering it with a cough. Judge Morrison's lips twitched, fighting a smile. Patterson adjusted his glasses, trying to recover, claiming the timing was suspicious. Franklin dies, and suddenly his son-in-law, who held no significant position, owns 76%. Megan countered smoothly. The timing was suspicious because Franklin knew he was dying and wanted to protect his company from exactly what was happening now. He watched his board run Myers like a personal piggy bank for years, prioritize short-term gains over long-term stability. He made a calculated decision to transfer controlling interest to someone he trusted. Someone who actually understood the business. Someone who wasn't going to sell off profitable divisions to pad quarterly reports. That wasn't manipulation. It was good business sense and foresight. Judge Morrison held up her hand, silencing both attorneys. She'd reviewed documentation submitted by both parties. The medical evidence was compelling. The legal documentation was in order. And frankly, the Sudoku puzzle was more convincing than most expert testimony she'd seen. The share transfer was completely valid and legally binding. Court dismissed. By 10 Tuesday morning, I reconvened the board in the same conference room where they'd fired me 6 days earlier, except this time I sat at the head of the table in Franklin's old seat. Everyone filed and looking like they were attending their own funeral. Laura looked like she could finally breathe again. Alan wasn't there at all, had already emailed in his retirement papers with the subject line him out. Honestly, I respected the commitment. I started with Mark, keeping my tone light. I told him his resignation was effective immediately. Don't forget your mug, I added, nodding toward that world's best executive mug he bought for himself because apparently no one else would. He opened his mouth, shut it, opened it again, then shut it again. The man looked like a fish, suddenly aware it wasn't underwater anymore. Eventually he stood, grabbed the mug, and walked out with whatever scraps of dignity he could gather. A beautiful silence settled over the room. I pulled out Laura's folder and got to business. The Kensington manufacturing sale? Canceled on the spot. Laura would draft the letter to the private equity firm, professional but crystal clear that we weren't interested now or ever. The Neuralink sale? Canceled too. That company was actually bringing real innovation to the table, unlike certain people who had been sitting in that room a few days earlier. I ordered a full operational audit of every department, with Laura in charge. She had my complete authority to fire anyone who couldn't justify their role or their budget. All executive bonuses were frozen until we got the company stabilized and our people stopped fleeing. I figured they'd survive on six-figure base salaries. If they really needed to save money, maybe they could cut back on their golf memberships. By the afternoon, the story had spread through the financial press like a brush fire. Bloomberg ran with, "Fired executive revealed as 76% owner of Myers Technologies." The Wall Street Journal went poetic. Corporate coup. How Franklin Mayer's son-in-law took control from beyond the grave. CNBC pulled me in for a remote interview where the anchor asked me straight up how I responded to critics saying I manipulated a dying man. I told her my critics should probably read the medical reports and court ruling before throwing around accusations they couldn't prove. Franklin was one of the sharpest businessmen I'd ever met. He made a deliberate choice to protect the company he built. If people wanted to call that manipulation, that was their business, but the law disagreed. When she asked if firing board members on my first day was extreme, I corrected her. Technically, it was my 5th day, but who was counting? Mark had been trying to sell off profitable divisions for personal gain. That wasn't leadership. That was looting. I wasn't there to play nice with folks who treated Myers like their personal ATM. The interview went viral. By 5 o'clock, I had 4 voicemail requests from other Nethrierks, 3 podcast invitations, and a surprisingly serious inquiry from 60 Minutes about a piece on family business succession. At 7:10, right as I was packing up to go home, Lena called. Before the phone even touched my ear, she started screaming about how I'd humiliated her. Everyone was talking about how she'd fired her own husband, who, by the way, actually owned the company. Did I have any idea what people were saying? What this did to her reputation? I let her unload for about 50 seconds before I calmly told her I'd heard every word. She wasn't angry because I embarrassed her. She was angry because she fired her husband without knowing he held 76% of her family's company. She was mortified because it made her look rash and uninformed, which was, frankly, accurate. I told her Shed humiliated herself. Shed wanted to be CEO so badly that she didn't bother asking questions or doing the bare minimum of due diligence. She wanted the title and the Instagram-ready lifestyle that came with it, but she had no interest in understanding what running a company actually required. I told her she could call me back when she was ready to have a real conversation instead of throwing a fit. Then I hung up. That night, I stood in Franklin's office, now my office, holding a glass of the expensive whiskey Head given me for my 30th birthday. Head told me to save it for a moment I truly needed it. The desk was spotless, the chairs perfectly aligned, and the view of Chicago at night was just as stunning as I remembered from all those late evenings we'd spent planning for this exact scenario. The city lights stretched toward the horizon like a field of electric stars. Somewhere out there, Connor was probably frantically calling his lawyers. Mark was definitely updating his LinkedIn profile. Lena was crafting a comeback story for social media. And I was standing here, holding the company Franklin poured his life into, ready to actually run it with the care it deserved. And yeah, firing Mark had been deeply satisfying. But this wasn't just about revenge. This was about restoring what mattered. Franklin had built Myers Technologies from nothing, created jobs, created value, built something real. The board had been slowly carving it up piece by piece, and Franklin trusted me to stop them. I raised my glass to the skyline, to the quiet office, to Franklin's memory, and to whatever was coming next. The real work was about to begin. We had audits to run, departments to rebuild, employees to protect, and a company to restore instead of strip for parts. But for tonight, I allowed myself a moment to appreciate it all. The satisfaction of a plan carried out flawlessly, of trust honored, of a legacy safeguarded. To new beginnings, I whispered,